Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Doom 2016 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now you're looking at the game currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings. And this is of course at the stock 15 watt TDP, and the level of performance that we're getting out of this is actually really decent. The 1% lows staying at the 30 range with averages in the low 40s pretty much means that overall the gaming experience is going to be very smooth and consistent. And you can see by the frame time charts that there is not any major fluctuation happening. Really in general, the engine that this runs on is just one of the best ones that I've ever seen, just in terms of having both good visuals and maintaining really solid consistent performance. It really are kind of undefeated when it comes to just making an engine that is absolutely incredible. So I think the last time they really dropped the ball was with like Rage, and even then that still had some very interesting features. I mean, the whole mega textures thing was very interesting, at least in the sense that it made Rage look really good on consoles while still performing at 60 FPS. But if you ever played Rage on the PlayStation 3, then you probably know what the texture pop-in for those mega textures was like. It was brutal. But in general, this engine performs super well on here, and it's holding up really well at the stock TDP, which usually ends up having the biggest issues with 1% lows. Thankfully, they're at least solid enough here that you can get away with playing the game perfectly fine. And again, the biggest savior of all of this is the fact there are no major stutters whatsoever. Again, if you just look at those frame time charts, everything is very smooth and consistent. There are no major spikes or anything like that. Of course, we could go through real quick and see what all of the different graphics settings are going to be like, just for posterity's sake. And you'll see that at the medium preset, we're pretty much having no difference whatsoever in terms of the level of performance that we're getting out of the game. Both visually and in terms of performance, it really doesn't seem to do much. At least I couldn't really tell much of a difference between this and the low preset. But I also do think that the low preset itself looks really good. And I'm not really one to overanalyze that graphics of games or anything like that. I mostly just play them. I don't really sit there and stare at rocks all day. So the fact that the gameplay at least wasn't affected in any majorly detrimental way. We're still at 1% lows that are at 30. We still have averages that are close to 40, and the averages and the 1% lows are closely in line with each other. So in general, it is consistent enough, but what's really holding things together is if you look at those frame time charts, no major spikes. If there were any major spikes happening at all, this would be a completely different experience. It just would not be doable. Of course, once we go to the high preset, that's where things really start to go awry, because the 1% lows start to finally dip under 30, and it's pretty consistent. And you'll see that the frame time charts now, instead of being just smooth and consistent most of the time, you'll see that there are now consistent, pretty noticeable spikes, and playing the game, you can feel it. You can feel the game almost fighting you as you try to move around. It definitely is not liking the frame rate that it's at right now, and it definitely starts to make the motion blur feel way worse, because I actually think that Doom has some of the best motion blur I've ever seen in a game. But once the performance starts to chug along, the motion blur can become kind of brutal. Of course, very similar situation when we go with the ultra setting, where our 1% lows are at ranges that are realistically going to be just out of the acceptable range for the vast majority of people. It really becomes a much rougher experience. I really wouldn't recommend it for pretty much anyone unless you are so desperate to play this at ultra. Like, you got a buddy over and you just want to flex on him real hard, so you just pull up your $500 laptop to try to run this game from 2016 at ultra settings. You just turn off the frame counter, don't really let them touch it too much, just let them see it for a couple of seconds, be like, yep, my system can definitely run this at ultra, and then close it immediately and don't let them look into it any further. If that's you, then I guess this is for you. But for most other normal human beings out there, I would just avoid this setting completely. Of course, now we could take a look at what the 25 watt TDP actually ends up doing to the game at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and you can see that what we're really seeing mostly is an uplift in the 1% lows and averages that still keeps everything close and consistent to each other, though there is no major uplift or anything like that. In general, it is just a smoother experience, which seems to just be what the 25 watt TDP ends up doing. It feels smoother, not necessarily because it's alleviating any stutters or anything like that, but the fact that the 1% lows are now comfortably in the mid 30s, where we're almost at 40, pretty much feels like a very noticeable uplift over the 30 FPS that we were at just the stock 15 watt TDP. Those uplifts in 1% lows are realistically the biggest upgrades you can do. And I really wish that more testing sites and channels would really start including 1% lows, because that's really the biggest indicator of performance. I'm blown away that there's still like channels and like websites out there that provide minimum numbers. Like they'll provide averages, minimums, and maximum. Minimums and maximums are the most useless information you could give somebody in terms of what performance is going to be like. Like, what do I care what the one absolute maximum frame or the one absolute lowest frame is going to be like? It's meaningless. You need to have the 1% lows and you need to have the frame time charts. That's why I like Gamers Nexus is like the channel that I respect the most, because they really go super in-depth with the performance charts. And once you look at a Gamers Nexus video, you really start to look at all performance testing differently. So I definitely encourage you guys to really look into learning how to actually measure performance properly, because a lot of the times you'll see people discussing performance online and all they'll ever mention is averages. They never bring up 1% lows. Averages don't mean anything if your 1% lows are absolutely atrocious. So the medium preset's performance impact becomes a lot more apparent at the 25 watt TDP, because now we're taking a pretty noticeable hit in the 1% lows, though our averages are still relatively good. So in general, it still feels really solid to play. Just graphically, I really don't see much of an improvement over low, where I don't really see the point in the performance hit, but that might just be me. I just might not care about any of the visual aspects that you might care about. In general, though, it is still very, very playable. Can't really say the same thing about the high preset. It's certainly still doable because the averages and the 1% lows are really close to each other. It's just you're playing out what is essentially more like a 30 FPS average, which is still doable. You know, people will play games like this. It's just one of those things where it's not the most ideal situation. But if you're gaming on integrated graphics, especially if this is not your first rodeo, then you should probably at this point understand that this is about the FPS that you'll be getting a lot of the time. And you can adjust to this. You know, I mean, people played console games at worse performance than this for years, decades. Hell, even some console games still run like this today. It's just this is the FPS you would see the most back in the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 era. And I mean the frame rate, not the resolution. Resolution was a completely different situation. Resolution wise, everything was like at like 500 here less back then. Surprisingly though, the ultra preset actually was not affecting the performance a lot in comparison to just going with high. So it's one of those things where if you're dead set on just playing with the higher settings at 1080p, then maybe just play at ultra. Why play at high? It seems like they both perform almost identically, at least at the 25 watt TDP. We did see that at the 15 watt TDP, the hit to the 1% lows was pretty massive. Here though, it's giving very similar performance in the sense that it's very consistent bad performance. Well, bad is a strong word. I really only associate bad performance when we start to actually dip below 20 FPS for the 1% lows. So I mean, this is definitely playable. I mean, I'm playing it, but I wouldn't exactly call this the most incredible experience or anything like that, and I would pretty much hesitate to actually play the game like this. I would more than likely just play something else. And if we take a look at the 30 watt TDP, we can see what it actually ends up doing to see if there's actually any meaningful gains here, and there realistically isn't. We're seeing very, very small improvements to our 1% lows and averages, to the point where they are pretty much a pretty irrelevant uplift overall, but definitely one that is there, though the heat increase is just astronomical. Like always with the 30 watt TDP, it really seems like the biggest gains are seen just in the temperatures. Performance wise, very rarely sees actually any meaningful uplift. Most of the time, the only time you will really see an uplift with the 30 watt TDP is in CPU limited situations, because it's the CPU that gains the real performance from the higher TDP. It's not the GPU most of the time, because what the 25 watt TDP really already ends up doing is it lets the GPU keep max clock speeds almost all the time. You will see some small fluctuations in situations where, you know, there's just more demand out of the CPU, so it has to just budget it out. But in general, the 25 watt gives you already most of the performance there, while the 30 watt TDP kind of just lets the GPU be at its max clock the whole time, and it lets the CPU kind of just go buck wild in terms of like clock speed. Depending on the game and load on the CPU itself, it could even go all the way up to, you know, 4 GB gigahertz. So that's really only in the situations where like the games are single threaded, because I'm pretty sure that the sustained all-core clock speed of this is significantly lower than 4 gigahertz. And you'll see here at the medium preset that we are seeing at least some uplift at the medium preset. Averages are pretty decent, and the 1% lows are struggling to try to reach 30, but it is at least smooth enough that you can, play this. But I just really don't see much of a visual difference between low and medium, honestly. Usually the biggest differences are seen going from like low to medium and then from medium to high. Then if there's a very high setting or an ultra setting, the visual differences will usually be minimal unless there's a specific setting that is tied to that. For example, some games have specific lighting and physics effects tied to certain settings where you could actually potentially see some major visual changes, but those kinds of situations are super rare. This is one of those situations where going from low to medium honestly does not look that different at all to me, but going from like something like medium to ultra, you can actually see some improvements. I just don't think it's worth it because I'm kind of just here to shoot dudes. I'm not here to just shoot pretty dudes, I think the fact that at this point I have, quite a few years worth of different generational experience with different consoles, that my tolerance for, graphics is just so much lower, where it's just like, this looks incredible to me, and this game is like 5 years old at this point and it looks still super good, and this is at the medium setting. So taking a look at the high preset, the thing that I'm really noticing most of all is the fact that what the 30-watt TDP ends up doing is it kind of just makes the experience at the higher settings very similar to the experience in the lower setting. Like, this is really like, if you go back and compare these numbers to the numbers that we were getting at the medium preset at 25 watts, is not too far off from where we're at here at the high preset at 30 watts. But the 1% lows are definitely taking a pretty big hit here, where we're dropping down into some pretty low numbers, and you'll see in general the wall of spikes that ends up happening in those frame time charts. I really just would not recommend playing like this. This is just a preset that's realistically going to be out of your playability range, especially because we're getting this FPS and these temperatures. And of course, lastly, we can take a look at the ultra preset here, which again, very similar performance to what we were getting at high, both being really not settings that I would recommend you play it at because it does not feel great to play. But it is surprisingly smooth and playable, and I mean, we are technically running Doom 2016 at ultra settings on integrated graphics, and we're getting a frame rate that, while not ideal, if you put this in front of people and told them, hey, play through a mission, they're going to be able to do it. They're going to be able to play it. They're not going to be able to say that it was an unplayable experience or anything like that. I mean, I was playing it perfectly fine, Like, if you can't play a game like this, it might not be the hardware holding you back. You know what I mean? It might just be you are incapable of playing the game. But anyways, that is it for the testing for today, guys. I went really hard on this one as well. I don't know what has gotten into me, but I started playing Doom and I kind of just felt like doing a more in-depth test because it is a game that I actually like. And it's not to say that I hate Saints Row the Third. Like, I really enjoyed it. It's just one of those things where, going back and playing it, it isn't exactly the greatest game ever. And to just sink an entire day into it was just kind of one of those things where I still look back on it and I'm like, why did I do that? So I didn't sink as much time into this one, but I went about as in-depth with it without adjusting the resolution. And I mean, this is somehow in a lot of ways performing better than Saints Row the Third. So it's, in one way, it shows how far we've come in terms of, engine optimization, but it's also hilarious that a game from 2016 was performing better than a game from 2011. But anyways, I will catch you guys in the next one.